it's often really quick and like, and just sort of
Yeah.
like, I guess, functional.
Hmm.
And then in a different, more intimate setting, I don't even know how to describe it. It was almost like, for like, and I remember like my body like feeling it for like a good half an hour after being like, oh my God, it was sort of just all over bodily release.
Hello. So this is Tom, writer, author, screenwriter, actor, drag queen, their persona Crystal. Whoa, what an exceptional voice. If you get the chance, YouTube their rendition of Sia's Chandelier. The falsetto cuts through you like a knife, puts the original to shame, I would say. Sorry about it, Sia. Sorry about many things at the moment, it seems. Tom talks in this episode about their journey to drag, coming out at an early age, sex at an early age, and why their relationship with pleasure, which is really full and delicious. Some might find it a little intense. There are places we go in this podcast that we haven't been before. Speaking of which, if listening to people talk openly about gangbangs and group sex is going to be triggering for you, take care of yourself and sit this one out. The way Tom speaks about sex with such relish is completely linked to the way in which they approach living their politics every day in any way that they can. They are also savage on middle class and mediocrity, which puts me to shame because I would say I am mediocre at the moment. And actually, that's not entirely true. I've been recording an audiobook this week. I do them quite often. This one's a sci-fi, a fantasy. I really enjoy those. Maybe the most. I shouldn't say that. I'd quite like to be cast for all audiobooks. Any you are putting in the offing, I'll do. But I particularly enjoy these because in between the wars and the orcs, there's often a little bit slipped in about the meaning of life. So a character will be stuck down a ravine, say, and it seems like, oh yeah, death's a definite. And then they'll just go into a meditative space where they connect with the elemental web which runs through all things and somehow summon this power they didn't realise they had before, which shoots them right up out of that mine shaft to heroic glory. I love it. I love that sense that if you just listen intently enough and connect with that web, you could potentially fly yourself right out of lockdown and straight over to New Zealand. Do you think they'd have a way of blocking that? Undoubtedly, yes. Particle or person, Arden will be on you. I also really enjoy these books because in general there are a huge range of characters and it's an invented world. So you get to pick the accents. I've made a bit of a boo-boo with this one. I'm about 1,600 pages in and two of the main characters, one is Liverpudlian and the other Welsh. They speak to each other on the regular. Every other page there's a dialogue. And at this stage in the novel, I'm not sure you can tell which one's which. Very close, those two accents. Very close, especially in this case. I should not say any more because I am uncertain about the crossover between Come As You Are podcast audience and the people who listen to those audiobooks. But I guess we'll see from the numbers if I ever get booked again for this ongoing series. We'll find out that there actually is a huge correlation between those two groups. Orgasms and orcs. Who would have thought it? Tom and I do get to speak about orgasms. It takes a little while. Hang in there. It all makes sense. I love the way this episode flows and everything coalesces on the flow factor. There's a little bit of distortion on Tom's line at points. We were doing this conversation over Zoom, so I apologise for that. You will get used to it and it effectively disappears about halfway through. As always, if you enjoy this episode and you like to fund the people who give you fun things, you can donate on ko-fi.com/HelenDuff for a one-off donation, or to become a member. We're going to bung a bunch of extra audio from this conversation that we couldn't fit into the episode onto Patreon, and that is patreon.com/HelenDuff if you want to access the stuff that we couldn't squeeze in here. Otherwise, strap in, strap on, and buckle up for the brilliant Tom Rasmussen. Tell me about where you grew up, because I watched your show that was at Soho Theatre as Crystal, obviously, your drag persona.
Yeah, I like persona. Yeah, I like persona.
You're amazing, amazing, Crystal. And you talk in that, or you make reference at least a little bit to like growing up and the kind of iconic women you were surrounded by. So tell me about that.
Yeah, I grew up just outside of a place called Lancaster, in the northwest of England. Sort of, I guess if you were to imagine the way that the media represents the North, it's kind of like that. Sort of, yeah, working class county, working class town, working class village. I don't know, it's weird. I've had a complicated relationship with the way I've described where I grew up, because I think for a long time when I moved south, I was very much sort of trying to just slightly class assimilate maybe and be like, oh yeah, I grew up in Manchester, because the first time I told someone I grew up in Lancaster, they were like, "Ah, I've never left zone 2." And so I was like, okay, it's just going to be easier for me if I like slip and slide around people who like judge me when I say I've never read Oscar Wilde. Like, why should I? Ugh. And so, yeah, where I grew up, I think I've really reconnected with it a lot in recent years, and reconnected with its value, and been so frustrated, I think, by the view, the sort of media view of the North and the working classes, and the sort of friend view of the North and the working classes that I have. And no one's intentionally among my friends mean or shitty, but it's this sort of constant perpetuated misunderstanding that it's grim up north, it's grey up north, that there's nothing there. And actually something I've come to realise when I've been sat at like big middle class dinner parties with people's parents who are like so posh they like can, you know, barely like move, is like there's actually so much more culture.
100% jowl.
Where I'm 100%, yeah, 100% sort of like rainbow trout. And like, you know, and I've realised there's so much more culture and warmth and like power where I grew up. And so it's been a weirdly sort of, yeah, I sort of judge myself for how I was. It was very classist of me. But I was dealing with a lot of internalized classism, and that's life, really. Not really too dramatic. People have been through worse. But yeah, now I would say it's an amazing place. It's wonderful.
Is it at uni that you started doing drag, or had you done it before?
Yeah. Well, I'd done drag alone a lot in my bedroom, but there was no real space in Lancaster. And then, you know, for my sins, I went to Cambridge. And it's really funny because, again, there's weirdly like, when I got in and I was in Lancaster, it was like everyone was like so proud. But I think like I'd particularly gone from a really working class place to a place where there were no working class people. And so I'd begun to associate all the amazing things I was learning at uni, which was not really my veterinary medicine degree. It was more like, you know, to be myself, to be a drag queen, to learn the importance of knowledge, to understand social structure. You know, I was so lucky and privileged to go to Cambridge. It was something that at home, me, all my friends, all my family were super proud of. And then among the middle classes and online now, it's sort of the shameful position to admit you've been to somewhere like that. And it is wild, but I mean, we should obviously be cognizant of our privilege or whatever. But it's just so funny that like, it's the classic middle class guilt thing. And I'm quite like, well, fuck you then. I don't know, it's funny.
I really struggle with that because it's a bit like what happens there. No one in my family had ever been to Oxbridge or knew anything about Cambridge. I went and I applied. But we didn't cross over. I don't think we met. The whole college system, for example, I applied.
Oh, what?
So I just applied to the ones that didn't have either a sane or like a biblical, direct biblical reference that I recognised, because I assumed that all the ones that were associated with the Bible would be hard to get into because they were more like, you know, like I thought Christ and Jesus must be the best ones. Because
I really tragically applied to Queen's because I was like, I'm Queen. It's so basic.
It assumes a lot of knowledge. What I found was, my family were massively proud and also really intimidated. So as soon as I got in, a lot of my relationships changed. I suddenly seemed much more intelligent than I had the day before. Do you know what I mean? And so that created a division. And I think the opportunities I was getting education-wise were so like much more specific. And that's why I think it's really that there's this shame and guilt associated with it, of getting that privilege, because what it means is it never gets shared out. So that style of education where it's like you get quite small groups and you get it's a really private school system to have really small classes and to get really like individual attention and be able to like discuss stuff without any consequences, just to chat. And that's not being replicated at all in like the state system because there just isn't the funding for it. And that's a consequence, I think, of it being really like hidden away in these institutions.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. It's so funny. I remember being like absolutely baffled when I met like Etonians. I'd only ever imagined Eton. I never read Harry Potter, but I imagined Eton, and also She's a Turf. But I imagine Eton as sort of like a Hogwartsy kind of place because I'd watched the films. I remember meeting an Etonian and then learning slowly over time that like there was like 1,000-person theatre. There were like wine tasting classes. It's something I find it hard to talk about, not because it's emotional, because I get so consumed by rage
Yeah.
about class, which is why doing drag at Cambridge really fucked me up because actually, yeah, I don't know, it was a weird shift. My parents were mad at me when I came out and then took a long time to get into it, and now they're the best people ever. But I think the biggest fight we ever had was when I told them I was quitting veterinary medicine to be a drag queen and a writer, because I didn't even know I wanted to write back then. But I think for them, they were like, "Oh my God, you are throwing away an opportunity that we never had." You know, no one in my family had been to uni except my one brother older than me, and he went to the like local uni, which is a good uni. Lancaster Uni is a really good one. We were the first people in our whole family to go to uni, and it's not that I was the first intelligent person in my family who could get into uni. It was that my parents didn't have the opportunity to, and it wasn't the done thing necessarily to leave where you were from. And the problem, I think the problem that like conversation slightly perpetuates is that like people aren't clever enough, and that's not the point, is that people don't have the opportunity to do so. And so I think for my parents, they were fuming because they'd worked so hard to allow me to self-actualize and do what I wanted to do, which was to become a vet. You know, and then when I changed that, they were like, fucking throw this shit away. You know, it's just,
Yeah. So do
it
you mean you
must be a
switched?
lot.
Did you switch degrees during or when you'd finished the degree? You then
I
decided not
did
to pursue
2 years of veterinary medicine and then I switched degrees to philosophy of science, which was actually, sounds quite useless, but it was the most incredible switch in sort of mind because I was reading Judith Butler and I was reading, I don't fucking know.
Then what you're doing is you're learning about, which is like such another step. You're not just learning about the knowledge, you're learning about how the knowledge is made and who gets to like disseminate the knowledge and decide where it's shared. And
That is what blew my
yeah.
mind in my final year. I remember like someone telling me about like a criticism paper in some course, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, the crit paper," and we didn't have them in vet med. It was just like learn these 1,000 names and actions of drugs, and then you're like, okay. I remember hearing about the criticism paper and having to ask my friend like, "What does that mean?" Because until then, I just thought criticism was like, you know, why is Hannah wearing that dress? Literally, honest to God, or like, honest to fucking God, I swear to my life. I came out when I was super young, came out when I was like 13, and I think I did it to sort of, I don't know, well, I was outed at school. It was so evident from day dot that I was gay. And then it was really upon learning that gay was a thing you could be that I realized that that's what I was. It wasn't me being like, am I gay, am I not? Never that. I knew.
When you come out as gay at 13, and it's definitely a feeling, it's definitely something that you're like, no, this is it. And like saying it out loud to people is one thing, but like knowing it internally is completely different. And then you start doing a degree later that's like about questioning structures and systems and the way we, like the language we use to name things. Did that then feel like another kind of awakening in a way? Like
I think that's probably when I realized that I was queer.
Oh, interesting.
And then probably led to me realizing that I'm actually non-binary, I think. You know, and actually sort of I have these wild beliefs that everyone really is, just we're repressed. You know, I don't want to like force everyone to be trans. But sort of the binary structure it's obvious. Any binary structure, cis or trans, whatever, they're all just, I guess, they're not, but they are. I don't know. We're responding to context and they're really important, and these things have been built around us and we can't escape them. But at the same time, sort of in a truly theoretical, ideological way, nothing exists.
I'm just interested in whether you then questioning all those things and realizing you're non-binary, trans, was that ever seen as like, oh God, Tom's just an intellectual now? Tom's above us with all his theories of like nothing exists and fucking.
Yes, yeah. Oh, I don't know. My parents are really smart people, and my family are. I think I had a phase in my life. I still am, but I had a phase in my life when I was very rabidly political and very, very I guess you could say militant, not to bring the language of police and the military into this conversation, but like I was very militant. And so I think that would often be quite alienating for my, say, like my older sister and brother who hadn't been to uni and who hadn't followed that sort of path for their life. And I think they would be like, it just gets a bit much. And I used to get really upset by that. And now I'm a bit like, they obviously listen and they're really good people and they try, but like they have way harder lives than I do in other ways. And so like, you know, my sister's got two kids to look after and she works full time. And her partner, not her husband, is away full time and is back like every eighth weekend or whatever because of the job he has to do in order to make enough money to survive. And like, why should my sister necessarily be as devoutly dedicated to the things that I am? And she should care in the way that I care about her kids, in the way that I care about her life. She should care about what I care about and she should care about being a good person. But I think sometimes actually it's not the most productive way to have a conversation.
At the moment, it sounds like you just had realization after realization. You were really sure at 13. At 20, you did this course and you were like, oh, okay, that changes how I think about me. Was there ever any disparity between like what you were learning in your head or opposite, what you were feeling in your heart and what you were able to kind of come to terms with?
Though that's actually really interesting because a lot, I don't know why. I think because I've always thought I'm a bit thick because of like maybe where I come from and how I was schooled and how that's sort of how, you know, and I'm obviously not, I know that objectively, but what I feel is always like the most unclever person in a room. And that's probably speaks to the rooms that I'm in and I need to change those fucking rooms. But I think, so for example, I have just written a book about marriage and
Yeah,
it's
that sounds
asked,
fascinating. I didn't know that.
no, and it asks this question that is in my absolute, it feels almost wired into my DNA because of how I grew up. I grew up Catholic. I grew up in a family that was centered on marriage. I grew up in wider families that were centered on marriage, in a community that adored marriage, that sees it as the probably one of the most important life events you can possibly have. And I dreamed of it, dreamed of it. In my early 20s, I thought it sort of realized that marriage was sort of arguably an oppressive structure and what does a relationship have to do with the state. And now I'm sort of at nearing 30 with a long-term partner who I love so much. And I have these weird feelings of like deep emotional want for something like that, like marriage. But then I have an intellectual sort of ideology that says that that is bad, that is anti-queer, that is sort of like pro-structure. It's kind of right-wing, I think, as an organizing tool, because it removes power from the people. And I think the question of this book, which is the questions I'm asking myself a lot, having been probably pretty unwoke, not that I was ever horrible, but like being pretty unwoke growing up, to then like being basically pretty bitchy because I that was my survival mechanism, to then like going all the other way and being like super woke and now interrogating all the gray areas in between those things. I'm now a bit like, how do I move forward if my heart, which is such a cringe way to say it, but if my heart says one thing and my head really believes another. And I think now when living our politics is the most important thing, one of the most, not the most, but one of the most important things you can do if you're privileged like me to now live a fairly middle class life, you know, how do you marry the two? And that's what this book is asking. And the answer I got to is like, I don't fucking know.
It's not me, not we, must be the situation. Burn it all down to the ground, let's start again. So we talked about so many things that have changed in your life, like in terms of where you grew up to then going to uni, then becoming part of a drag group, to then becoming a solo performer, to then becoming a writer. How those transitions impacted you sexually? Because I can imagine they're all quite big confidence tricks. And I wondered whether that was reflected in what you were experiencing, in like relationships intimately.
Well, I mean, really, I guess I would have to sort of gently and speedily chart my sexual history because it's changed so much. The thing that is only starting to change now, I'm arriving hopefully more at, I don't know, some self-knowledge about who I am. I think I'm starting to get over this feeling of undesirability because, you know, I was like gay, poor, fat, spotty, ginger, and bullied really badly, and also really iconic. I'm going to give myself that at school. I was funny and kind of became quite popular because I could hold my own against like people who would like spit at me and throw rocks at me. And so it was this oddly sort of quite joyful repartee we'd have where someone would hock up a big logie on my face, and then I would say something way wittier, and then everyone would laugh, and it weirdly became quite a good. It became quite a good survival mechanism. Not that I'd recommend anyone have to go through any of that, but I think the thing that I felt a lot through all of my sexual sort of forays, and I've had a lot, that I was always the undesirable one. And now I think being in a long-term relationship where we're really negotiating, constantly you have to negotiate the role sex plays in that. I think now I'm coming to terms with the fact that I'm actually quite desirable on my own terms. But I think that's only as you start to accept things about yourself.
I'm interested in, as the young person who's like using humour and wit and like an acerbic capacity to come up with comebacks really quickly, did that mean that sexually you also, or at least when you were engaging with partners, you had to be kind of the one who was funny and fast? And because having sex with somebody can be quite vulnerable, so is it quite hard to go into a vulnerable place if you're like being...
No, not really. I mean, it was the classic old school gay way. I met people online. I met people sort of kind of cruising. And I always had sex with people at least twice my age because they were the kind of people who you would find. One time I had sex with someone quadruple my age who's now dead of old age. Iconic. And and you know what? And I'm not going to say I regret it because I actually had a fucking fabu time, and I was sort of, I don't know, it helped me a lot, but I had really outrageous sex with a lot of different men. And then I would, instead of like keep that secret, I would tell everyone. And I would like say the most outrageous thing I'd done that week. I sort of had this sort of metric in my head that was like, this is me dealing with my shame, which in a way it was a journey to dealing with a lot of gay shame that I had, you know, by being iconic, unapologetic, honest. But I think I'm less there now, which is nice. I think just because in my first book, I wrote all those stories down. And weirdly, it's such a trash cliche when you're like, I've let those stories go. But I have actually, if I'm honest. I'm doing this TED Talk in a few weeks, and I don't want to trash. It's an amazing team that I'm working with on it. But it's about shame and kind of about sex. Recently, I was like, this is the last time I think I'm going to make work about shame, because I've been doing it for arguably 20 years now, and I'm 29. I've probably been making some sort of work about shame for about 20 years. And I'm kind of in the place where I'm a bit like, I want to like talk about heterosexuals. I want to give my opinion on other people rather than have to give my justification for my existence or my justification for my like brilliant overcoming story of all these hard things. Sex for me was actually always quite a magical place. I think there was times in my life, definitely when I was young, I used to love getting picked up in an ASDA delivery truck, being shut in the back, being taken to some country road and being like rammed really hard by some like 61-year-old man who, and it was a lot, did a lot of like BDSM, but probably like not well practiced, sort of seeking out sex where I could really have the shame elevated and really have it like laid to bear during sex. And then I had a moment where I'd sort of had this realization that I was seeking out quite harmful. I wasn't being healthy.
Feel free to correct me if I'm completely getting this wrong. But you were sort of really enjoying the outrageousness of your own life, both like, and I say outrageousness in the sense that when you were sharing with other people, you were kind of conscious of how of choosing the most scandalous and most juicy details that would like cause a scene and be attention grabbing and be exciting as well. Like, having watched your shows and knowing as your person, you're an exciting performer to watch because you have a really keen eye for like what's going to turn people on in terms of a story, like the details. So I can see that being satisfying to play that role, to play that like almost like jester role, but using your own life experience as the material. So I can imagine there is a kind of addictive quality to thinking, okay, I've got a story like that. I need new, almost like weirdly being your own content like
creator.
No, but you're not both the creator and you're the forum. So you're going like, we've had that, we need this now. You're like you're like a Black Mirror where it's like you've become your own moderator who's going like, come on, what's the next thing? What's the next big thing? How can we push it? You hit a wall with that surely, because suddenly you're like, I think I'm endangering myself actually, and I need to stop.
Well, that's it. I think you've hit the nail on the head better than I can, which is like, that was it. I was like, oh, you're seeking out these experiences to tell a story, and you're not doing them because it's what you actually want. And so, yeah, basically, exactly that. Exactly. I would never, it was never as sort of calculated as being like, okay, we've done fisting, now it's time to do like drinking from a toilet.
There was no list that you were ticking off, yeah.
But it was very much like I would be thrilled if something new happened, and I could be like, guys. In the beginning of my new book, I talk about the acquisition of queer capital. And it's sort of it's set at my brother's wedding, which is sort of very class conscious wedding. And it was this big wedding, and he's earned a lot of money, and they spent a lot of money. And I was like judging him for that in this book. And then I'm a bit like, I guess it's sort of similar to me acquiring queer capital, which is like, Tom has the most iconic, most queer sex stories, and then like being desperate to keep acquiring that.
There's a commodification of queer culture, right?
Yeah. I guess this is
That isn't a
that's
crossover.
right. Well, more like this is particularly, there wasn't necessarily a commodification. I guess there was among my queerest friends. Everything's a commodity, so my sex stories became that, but it wasn't sort of the commercialization of queerness in the way we see it at like Pride, where it's like, the army is marching, and you're quite like, girl, like, come on. Like, and I know, yeah, you can have gay soldiers, and that's fabu, but the military's trash, and war is trash, and war harms LGBT people, and so it's sort of it's all so complicated. But it's the first time I'd ever sort of put it like that it was like I was acquiring queer capital, and it made me feel good. It feels like it's more for me now, and less for like telling of the story. And so I don't know. I feel so bored. I guess what's interesting is now I feel quite boring these days because I don't feel the need anymore. And that's because in my career and in my relationships, I've been sort of empowered in the knowledge that what I have to say about things is worth saying. Not always, obviously, because sometimes we all need to shut the fuck up and listen. But like, I think I now don't feel like my value in a room is like how outrageous a story can you tell. And when that changed, not on a huge scale, but I think a few friends of mine were a bit like, ooh, this is new. And it's not that I ever made a one-day active decision to be like, I'm never talking about sex. I can't stand prudish people. I can't stand it. It's my peeve. I can't stand people like, oh, I don't talk about sex. And I get if you don't talk about sex for certain reasons about triggering or safety, but if you're just someone who like is prudish, shut up. God, grow up. Oh, I can't.
And you want me to with my elbow? Okay. If you're having kind of outrageous experiences, is it harder to get off on stuff that is more tender and like, what's the word?
I know what you mean, intimate or whatever, or like
boring.
Present.
Yeah,
Boring. No, because I guess when I first started to have that kind of sex with my first long-term partner, that was a novelty. So I don't know, I don't know what it is really. I've been lucky in that I've managed to, I don't know how, but somewhat dodge a complicated relationship with sex. I think all my experiences would point to maybe having that. And I think it's complicated in the ways that I've retold it. It's complicated in the ways that I felt about it. It's complicated in the choices that I've made. But it's never been complicated down in the dirty. Part of me, when I've thought about this before, thinks sometimes it's because, and I don't feel this anymore, and that's a self-esteem issue. I always felt quite lucky to be there and like, oh, someone's desiring me and I'm desiring them. That also, I guess one thing that is true is that for the first sort of maybe 10 years of sexual activity, and I started being sexually active, I don't know if this is problematic to say, but when I was like 14, but I think for the first maybe maybe the first 7 years, I very much was like, I'm there to pleasure the other person. So that's maybe a thing. And I would really find a lot of pleasure in that. And I still do a lot of pleasure. But now I've definitely stepped more into being like, I also deserve to be very much pleasured. And I deserve that. So I think what's interesting is, I'm someone who's really, obviously, as we all should be, very, very much cognizant and always thoughtful about consent, as we all should be. But I think the way I learned a lot of my boundaries with consent was by having them breached. And I don't mean in a way where I was saying no. I mean in a way of being like, oh, I'll try that. And then being like leaving the situation, being like, I really didn't like that. And so it becomes, I've tried basically everything except blood letting in sex.
Right.
And sounding. I haven't done sounding.
What is sounding?
It's where you put sort of metal rods down the urethra. I haven't done
Right.
that. But basically everything else I've tried. But I had a friend, an older gay friend in New York who was like a sounding expert, and I used to think it was impossibly chic that he sort of would wear head to toe Rick Owens and talk about the cues of men who come to him to be sounded, and he's the expert, and I would find it
Is there an
really
electrical
chic.
pulse? Is there an electrical
No,
pulse? Okay.
I mean maybe there is, but it's just these sort of very smooth metal or rubber rods that you put down, and apparently if you get it right, you can make someone piss and come at the same time, and apparently it feels incredible.
Oh my God.
I know, isn't it iconic? I think, and I
I'm just
think,
really struggling, like physically, to understand how, if there's something in, how anything comes out.
well,
Am I being
you
stupid?
release it. So
Okay.
it's almost like you plug it up and then, but I guess I've always found that quite nice because maybe I guess like years ago I wrote an article for Vice about fisting, and I interviewed all these, people, these gay men who were committed fisters in the fisting community. And I remember I had sort of certain judgments about it because we all do. And not that I was like, "Ugh," but I had certain just internal judgments about it. And I interviewed them, and it was the most wonderful thing where a lot of these men were saying that it's the place in the gay community they felt most cared for, they felt most thought of, they felt most catered to. And I was like, isn't that special? Isn't it so nice that even if it's not for me, there is somewhere, obviously there's things that are not okay, and that's about consent. But when there are places where 2 or 10 or 100 consenting people can meet, do something that is so out of my remit and out of my thought process, and they can find a place where they're like nurtured and uplifted in that desire. And I find that quite nice. I find that quite comforting as an idea. I think it's really wonderful. I'm quite like, yes, you go get fisted. You enjoy that.
Can you describe for me what it feels like to orgasm? You can be as specific as you like or as abstract as you like.
You know what? It depends. If it's me masturbating, then I guess it varies. It's often really quick and like, and just sort of like and just sort of like, I guess, functional. And then if it's like in a different, more intimate setting, or not, I'm not synonymizing intimacy with sort of like tenderness always. If someone else is making me orgasm, it often is really like bodily, all over sort of bodily, because sort of you're relinquishing a certain control, or trust, and you're relinquishing a certain self-control and knowing and trusting that someone's there. And it's kind of incredible, actually. Makes me smile. I'm smiling right now thinking about it. Then I remember the one particular orgasm I had where I had taken a lot of drugs. I was in Berghain in Berlin, and I think I'd had sex with 13 people, and I hadn't climaxed yet. And then at the very end of the night, in a toilet cubicle, I was with someone and I climaxed, and it was like, I don't even know how to describe it. It was almost like, for like, and I remember like my body like feeling it for like a good half an hour after, being like, oh my God, it was sort of just all over bodily release. And
like a tingling?
it's hard to describe it as physical, I guess, because tingling is just tingling.
Yeah, it makes it
It's
sound like
just
pins
sort
and
of
needles, which is not.
it's a sort of all over bodily, like, I guess, like release of tension and sort of like a wash of allowing other people. I don't know. It's kind of, I was like, God, what a collectively achieved orgasm that was. I don't know.
It takes a village. It takes 14
Yes.
people in Berghain.
Yes, it does. I do feel jealous in a nice way of, a lot of my female friends who have different orgasms, because like I have a housemate who will sometimes take a day off and spend the whole day masturbating, and will be like, come out of her room like, oh, I just had 9, and I'm like, that is incredible, and I'm jealous.
And each one will be slightly different. I think I've come to really love the fact that I can have like external and internal ones, and that you can tell the difference between them, and that they impact you differently. Sometimes I've had ones that actually I get angry after. Like I think maybe I'm in the wrong place, and so like that much release and that much kind of, that different kind of energy going through me, afterwards I'll just get really grotty. I'll just get really grumpy. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'll be super pissed off and I have to have a hot chocolate.
Obsessed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Get out. Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Don't want to be touched anymore.
I remember being sat with my sister and her girlfriends, and I'm 10 years younger than my sister, and I remember one of them saying that, like, coming to this drinks, and this was like maybe 3 years ago, being like, guys, I've just had my first orgasm, and they were like, what? And she was like, for years I thought I'd been orgasming, and then I just had the first one, and oh my holy fucking God, now I know what it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Obviously.
it is like that. It is like that. And you almost feel bad for dismissing like your experiences before, because there's some sort of pride, isn't there, in making yourself come and masturbating, and like, especially I think for women are really encouraged to self-pleasure, and which is great. And so then saying like, oh, I had an orgasm through penetration or with a partner, makes it sound like you're saying, oh, orgasms on your own aren't as real. But there is a difference, I think. And it's probably to do with that giving up of control and that feeling of like you've trusted somebody else enough to actually like sort you out.
It is a deeply, deeply intimate act, even though I've done it with people who I couldn't tell you their names or their faces. Sometimes I find that actually hysterical. I'm like, I'm looking at you or I'm passing you in the street, we're both clocking each other, and like we're not even saying hello to each other or acknowledging it, and you've like come in me. That's that's iconic. I find that really iconic. I'm quite like, you have like come inside me and we're not even going to say hello, and I don't know your name, and I find it really, and so, and I just sometimes when I imagine like it's that a scene in Amelie, which is so trash to bring up, but where, you know, where she looks out over Paris and she sees all the orgasms happening. There's a place in Soho opposite the photographer's gallery, which is this gay sauna called Sweatbox, which is where it's a gay sauna, and I've had quite a few orgasms there. And there's a lot of gay saunas around London which are really hidden that I've had group sex in and orgasms in. And often I'll be walking and there'll be like me, and then like a family, and then like someone walking their dog, and then like whatever in like very sort of middle class, and I'll be like, right below where we are all stood right now, I have been like gangbanged by like 8 men. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of kind of, I love the idea of the geography of orgasms. I think it's really fun. Do you know what I mean?
Does that also fuck you up? Does it fuck you up thinking like about the layers of pretense that are going on in our world? Like a double thing of like delighted by everything that's sort of underground and secret and like gets to happen, but also like fuck you that people pretend it's not happening or have no awareness of like a whole.
Well, I guess I feel quite protective of that world, actually, because I wouldn't want it to be, you know, because it's definitely been necessary for queer people to build spaces where they can find like alternative modes of touch. If you like can't hold hands in the street, if like someone's gonna look at me, stare at me for holding hands in the street, then I'm not gonna let them into like my orgasm space or whatever. But I feel quite I don't know, I find it quite funny. I actually just find it quite funny.
Great.
And I think since getting a dog, she's actually a boy, and she's like very, very, well, she's biologically a boy, what that means. She has balls, and she is fab. And I took her with a friend of mine who's very, very smart and very, very what's the word? Very brilliant observer. And we went to Clapham Common like before Christmas and went on a dog walk and took the dog to that part where all the big dogs play. And there was like literally 30 dogs, 30 families, me and my friend. And it was this really middle class, really Clapham-y scenario where everyone was like, Odderly, Odderly. And I was like finding it fucking jokes. And all of these dogs fuck each other. They try and fuck each other. They're not often successful. They all just fuck and like bite and roll around and like bash into each other. And my friend, it really made me smile. My friend was like, it's so funny how family life is. You have kids and then you go and watch your dogs fuck at the weekend. And I just found it so funny. And then I would be like, oh, 69ing to like, you know, some like posh mom, and they'd get really like uppity. And I'd be like, girl, come on. Like what it is, come on. God, people are wild. But like, yeah, I don't know. I do find it funny. I think it's boring. I think society is really boring.
Yeah.
It's so dull. My God, it's just, especially middle class society, I'm really learning. It's like aspiration to absolute mediocrity.
So that was Tom. What did I tell you? Savage about middle-class mediocrity. Taking it down, one British bulldog mounting a Shih Tzu at a time. Step away from the blueberry and ricotta pancakes, people. It's time to sort out the school system. I really enjoyed this episode. As we discussed, Tom has a new book coming out. I'm going to drop links to that and their last book, Diary of a Drag Queen, which was fantastic, in the episode notes, along with, obviously, all of our Ko-fi and Patreon details. Plus, if you can, the recording of their live show from the Soho Theatre run. It was such a brilliant performance. In the episode is Crystal. It was called Crystal Rasmussen Presents the Bible 2, brackets, plus a cure for shame, violence, betrayal, and athlete's foot. If you can get a way to watch it online, it will really bring some light to your lockdown. This episode was edited by Daisy Grant, and Come As You Are, the podcast, is produced by me, Helen Duff, Lorna Treen, and Daisy Grant. Hit us up if you want to employ brilliant women to create top quality audio content. If you can't subscribe to our Patreon or support us on Ko-fi, that's cool. This is a difficult moment. Please send the podcast to someone you think will love it and write us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen. We will be back next week with another banger as per. Until then, look after your earlobes as well as everything else and enjoy yourself.